Cisco has. It.
Yes, it should. Can I hear you?
I can hear you guys. Can you hear me?
Very loud.
Yes. Yeah, I'll turn you down. So
Oh.
that's
Sorry. Thanks, Jazz.
9.
Right, Jane's going to miss the first two. That's right. Yeah. Okay. Right, ready. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the reconvening of Hearing Stream 7. Today and yesterday is dedicated to hearing the officers respond to questions and talk to their reports. This morning we have Anna Stevens, who's beaming in from London. She will be talking to her reports on the hospital zone and the tertiary education zone. The panel this morning is minus Commissioner Black, who's recused herself from hearing submissions on these two zones. So welcome, Anna. Hopefully it's not too late for you over there.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks for letting me beam in.
Right, so we'll be interested in just sort of the key points to your report, in particular, any matters arising since submitted evidence was lodged and circulated, and any changes in your views and recommendations as well. So over to you.
Sure, thank you. If it's all right with you, I'll just do just some introduction comments, and then what I might do is do the hospital now, and then when we get to the tertiary education zone, I can kind of leave those intro notes for then if that suits you.
Okay, no, that's great. Thanks.
Awesome. So tēnā koutou, Commissioner Schofield, Commissioner Pomare, Black, and Commissioner Daish. So I'm Anna Stevens. I don't think I've met you, Commissioner Pomare, so nice to meet you. So I, just for a bit of context, am a former team leader in the district planning team, having presented on Hearing Stream 3 and the wrap-up hearing in terms of design guides, and was previously topic lead also for view shafts, city centre, wind and design guides. So just for context, Miss Lisa Hayes wrote the Section 42A reports for the hospital zone and for the tertiary education zones, and unfortunately due to personal reasons she couldn't be here today, so I'm stepping in to kind of provide some context and also answer any questions that the panel has. So as well, just to note that all my credentials and qualifications are in my previous Section 42A reports as well, for the panel's reference. So under the operative plan, so I'll try and kind of reasonably brief in terms of just stepping through a little bit of context to these hospital zone and tertiary education zone, noting that their predecessor name in the operative plan is the institutional precincts. So under the operative plan, the institutional precincts covers the Wellington Regional Hospital, Newtown, Massey University's Mount Cook campus, and Te Herenga Waka Victoria University Kelburn campus. So recognise these institutions make an important contribution to the cultural and economic welfare of the city and its health and education services. So chapters 8 and chapters 9 set out the objectives, policies, rules and standards, and then there's also bespoke institutional precinct design guides with specific sections on each of the 3 institutions. So these the institutional precincts haven't been amended apart from one minor plan change to Victoria University, the zoning extent over the course of the operative plan, and have been subject to a rolling review. So I would note as well, in the operative plan, the objectives and policies for the institutional precincts are generalised so that they can apply to all 3 institutions. So there's no specific provisions for individual institutions. So they seek to encourage good development within the institutional precinct zone and protect the amenity of the surrounding residential area. And as noted, manage through rules, standards and the design guides. So in terms of just noting with the design guide link there as well, there's the height and location plan that directs the height and density of development within each precinct, under the operative plan. So the heights are directed in stories. I also note that there's bespoke provisions within the tertiary education zone for the Victoria University for 320 to Terrace, which is the Gordon Wilson Flats, which I'm sure everyone is very familiar with. So in terms of the review process that occurred, there was a thorough issues and options review looking at resource consent applications for all 3 institutions, having a series of meetings with council consent planners with each of the institutions, in terms of understanding how the provisions have worked to date, but also to understand what the 15-year plan was for each of these institutions, as well as meeting with mana whenua, and also the institutions in terms of their relationship with mana whenua and aspirations for the site and how that's incorporated. So at a high level, which has somewhat flowed into some of the language of the submissions as well, but some of the issues that I identified was that the strategic importance of these institutions wasn't recognised in the operative plan. Aspects of the regulatory approach for activities and buildings needed to be revisited, as well as the structural language, and more provide a clearer framework for the users and also the decision makers, to name a few. A key change being that under the National Planning Standards, which came out at the same time as the District Plan Review, the National Planning Standards introduced special purpose zones, which then rezoned the tertiary education zone and the hospital zone for the 3 precincts. So this enabled a bespoke set of provisions, but we also had the strategic direction, particularly CEKP 05, which gives strategic direction around health and education facilities. I will just note for context, because I think it's quite important, that the draft district plan had just the Wellington Regional Hospital applied in terms of the special purpose zone, but through consultation on the draft plan and submissions received from Vital Healthcare and also Southern Cross, the decision was made to include Southern Cross Hospital in Newtown, also Wakefield and Bowen hospitals as well, and recognising their strategic importance to the city as well. So moving right along to the notified proposed plan provisions. The objectives and policies recognise that the hospital and university campuses are regionally, nationally and internationally significant institutions. They also seek to enable the efficient and effective operation of the institution, while also trying to focus on high quality design, resilience, mana whenua aspirations and the like. I will just highlight a couple of notable changes from the operative to the proposed plan. There's now a specific tertiary education facility definition and a hospital activity definition, which are comprehensive in nature in terms of a long list of primary and ancillary activities. The thought behind that being that that reduces the extent of the rule framework in terms of having a bigger list within the definition. There's also permitted activity status for activities that fall within that, otherwise discretionary, and the rules with the permitted activity status for minor building work, maintenance, for example, apart from the Gordon Wilson flats. And then it's otherwise controlled or restricted discretionary activities for when permitted activities are not met in terms of construction. I will note one thing in terms of the bespoke design guidance for the institutions was not carried through into the proposed plan. Instead, there was a reference in the matter of discretion to Centres and Mixed Use Design Guide, which I'm very happy to take questions on. And also there was, as I'll note soon, for the section 42A, Ms Hayes has recommended aligning with the ISPP provisions that the matter discretion gets removed. Instead, there's a reference included in the quality policy in terms of fulfilling the intent of the Centres and Mixed Use Design Guide. There's also the introduction of building heights within the chapter itself. So these are carefully reviewed and particularly looking at what was allowed under the operative plan versus actual heights, and noting there was a bit of discrepancy. So there's been an uplift in terms of maximum height limits and density allowed across these campuses. So just moving on to the section 42A, Ms Hayes recommended minor amendments to the notified provisions. Following changes, in particular, just to highlight, so changes to reference within the Objective 3 and 4 explicitly where the intent of the clauses are just relevant to Wellington Regional Hospital and Puna Waiora rather than the private hospitals. Removal of key pedestrian street reference, and also any kind of subsequent changes that have been made to align with ISPP provisions, so the design guide reference, for example. And Ms Hayes has also recommended adding the word adjoining to restrict the application of matter control / discretion to when rooftop elements can be viewed from adjoining roads or open space. My last points to just note before I will hand over to questions. It's just in terms of Ms Hayes' recommendations around minor and inconsequential amendments. So this kind of has applicability to both tertiary and hospital, and as you probably will note, there is quite a bit of connection in terms of similar amendments made across the two chapters in terms of things like design guide references or where it was appropriate for both. So there has been a couple of amendments in terms of recommendations from the independent hearings panel. So for example, changing active engagement with mana whenua to active partnership as per recommendations, and the spelling of Māori, M-O-U-R-I, to Māori, M-A-U-R-I. Both were referenced within the two chapters, but just having the correct spelling there. And also just a change that also has fallen out of the ISPP provisions is for the hospital zone in particular, tertiary zone, is changing to quality development outcomes rather than quality design outcomes in terms of the title of the design policies. And I think that is the extent of my notes, but yeah, very happy to take questions on the hospital zone and then can transition into the tertiary zone as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms Stevens. Other questions for the panel? Dash?
Yeah, just on, I've only got one question on the hospital zone itself, and that is in relation to the design guide. I guess the basic question is the council quite confident that with, if you like, a bespoke land use such as a hospital, that the centres and mixed use design guide is set up to appropriately look at design outcomes, or is there any potential nuances to that design guide to take into account the specific activities that occur on the hospital site?
Yeah, that's a very fair question in terms of I know that's been raised particularly by Ms Tree in terms of the legal statement. So I guess stepping back in terms of the notified provision connects back to the centres and mixed use design guide, but there has been, I guess, if you will, a change in tact from the operative plan where there was bespoke design guidance to where instead, in terms of my drafting of the chapter and the focus and talking to lots of stakeholders, including the council's urban design team, was that it could be addressed through having a more targeted policy in terms of design outputs anticipated for the hospital. So that's the policy I could actually reference. P4, so urban form, quality and amenity, is very targeted to the hospital specific design, but also I guess initially probably looking at having the centres of mixed use design guide there in terms of capturing broader design outcomes around things like street interface, responding to site characteristics, things like that as well, where those guidelines were still very applicable to the hospital in terms of good development and design outcomes. I will say as well that having been the kind of topic lead for the design guide review and being witness to the expert conferencing on that, there was still a comfort from all the experts involved that these design guides should be applicable to chapters like the hospital, tertiary education zone and waterfront, for example, where they're not probably your typical, when you hear centres and mixed use zones, that you think they would fall within that kind of umbrella. But definitely my understanding was that their opinion was that it very much should still apply. So an example being, Mr. McIndoe, who my understanding was involved in the original drafting of the design guides and the operative plan for these institutions. He, for example, had comfort with the fact that the centres and mixed use design guide could apply. One thing I'm happy to do as a writer reply is provide more response in terms of targeted guidelines, or provide examples of that. But certainly having just a brief look just before, things like that are just responding to context, so G1, your vegetation and planting, street interface, ground floor use, passive surveillance, for example, just to name a few. I think, in my opinion, these are all relevant design considerations. But I think an important point I would just note as well is that post the review of the residential design guide and centres and mixed use design guide, the design statement and kind of the additional context provided in the introduction to this guide provides that flexibility, and it also notes that not all guidelines will be applicable, and as part of the design statement preparation, applicants can identify why certain guidelines might not be appropriate. So that's certainly a tool, I think, particularly for the hospital and tertiary education institutions, that they can identify that actually some of these are more applicable for the city centre zone, for example, where it's talking about tall towers and things like that, that obviously don't have the same applicability to a certain degree. I mean, that's possibly a poor example given how high some of the development goes, particularly in the centre of the hospital, but that's certainly my reckoning that there's an inbuilt flexibility where a lot of the guidelines could be applicable, but there's also ability to identify where they are simply not applicable to a hospital development.
Okay, and just a follow-up question to that. So it's not only the centres and mixed-use design guide, it's the detailed provisions in P4, which differentiates the hospital zone from other sorts of centres and mixed-use activities.
Correct. So particularly thinking for P4, it was looking at kind of the layout of hospitals, and then separately for the tertiary education zone for those institutions in terms of how things are designed, who they're designed for. So thinking around things like accessibility, particularly for lots of different users, for those that are unwell, for older population, things like that as well. SEPTED type provisions, and I think that particularly SEPTED, for example, so crime prevention type focus has followed through into the policy framework. But that is another example where those kind of guidelines, for example, in the Centres of Mixed Use Design Guide would be applicable. But certainly the policy has been tailored to be appropriate and a kind of a strong direction for consent planners to consider as part of any development within the hospital, looking at P4 in particular.
Okay, thank you for that. No questions, no further questions. Thank you.
Kia ora, Ms. Stevens. Can you hear me?
I can. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thanks very much for stepping in today to provide the report for Ms. Hayes. I don't have many questions for you. Mine was around the design guide as well, which has already been covered. I think really the only question I have is in relation to paragraph 50. There's a reference there to a request from Taranaki Whānui, who have requested that triggers be included to activate partnership or engagement with mana whenua in respect of design opportunities within the hospital zone. Ms. Hayes didn't agree that this should be a district plan requirement, which I understand, but I didn't think that what she was saying was that it couldn't be Māori design outcomes couldn't be facilitated through the district plan, and I was just wondering what your view on that might be.
Sure.
So yeah.
Yeah, so my understanding of reading that paragraph as well was that possibly Ms. Hayes thought at the time that it wasn't appropriate to kind of have a hard and fast trigger in the rule framework.
Yeah.
And I might be thinking of tertiary education in particular, but that all these institutions have these existing relationships with mana whenua, and that's certainly something that I explored with each institution, because when I was drafting, I was very keen to understand more about what are their existing relationships like with mana whenua on both sides, and also kind of how does that historical link play out in terms of existing features. So the AWA network, for example, at the Wellington Regional Hospital, and then also kind of design going forward. Certainly at the draft plan stage, I can recall kind of looking at whether triggers might be possible in terms of putting it in the rule framework. Ultimately, I think kind of based on engagement and where I landed, it was more on having it within the objective and policy framework. I think at one point I may have considered matter of discussion, yes. But I think I felt reasonably confident that there was existing relationships and existing plans, which I think for tertiary education, Massey has commented on in terms of these conversations happening already. But certainly it was very important to me that it was still within the policy framework, which then gets hooked back through the matters of discretion in terms of engagement with mana whenua. And I think actually I agree with Ms Hayes in terms of that change in the panel's recommendation to active partnership rather than engagement. I eat my words,
Yes.
but to actually make that happen. And I think possibly this, and I can't speak on her behalf, but possibly the thought was that that conversation will be happening already between mana whenua and these institutions, and a bespoke outcome happens in terms of design. But I certainly think it's an important policy consideration.
Yes.
And just give one other example, if I may, and apologies for jumping between topics, but they're quite interlinked because
fine.
they're operative plan history.
Yes.
So I met with the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Māori Studies, Professor Higgins at Victoria University, and it was a really good conversation in terms of understanding, how does Victoria, for example, how does design considerations play out with their relationship with mana whenua in the built form, but also things like wayfinding, interpretation, things like that. And that was a very encouraging conversation to know that that's happening already. But certainly, I'm sure there's more than space for all organisations to. I guess take that to a next step as well through ZIP development going forward.
Yes, thank you. That's really, really helpful context, and that has broadened my understanding immensely of the approach taken in PDP. Just picking up on that point then around design outcomes, do you think? I take your point that the requirement for engagement with mana whenua is there. Through the objective, but in terms of design outcomes and trying to ensure that the process, there is a facilitation of that process with Māori, do you consider that there might be a benefit to including a specific reference, say in P4, to facilitate Māori design outcomes and new developments, and I think that deals with alterations as well, and additions within the hospital sites.
Yeah, no, great question. I just double checking P3 because I think you've identified a good gap in terms of P4 in terms of design specifically. So P3, hospital P3 does talk around collaborating on the design and incorporation of traditional cultural elements into public space on the site. But possibly you have identified an area that could be enhanced in terms of P4, given obviously P4 is very design orientated and urban form outcome, that there could be a gap in P4 or that kind of connection made there as well. I guess probably P3, it was placed there as a kind of as a homing policy in terms of connecting with other mana whenua policy aspirations within the zone. But certainly possibly I just want to double check the rules to make sure that there is that connection back to P3. Yeah, so P3 is referenced in additions and alterations and also in the construction, but I think that link could be made a bit clearer in terms of design.
Thank you. Can I impose on you to perhaps come back to us with some proposed wording around that?
Sure.
And you'll write a reply. Thank you. I think that was the main question. I'll just double check. Oh, that's right. There was just one other question in relation to paragraph 182, and you referred to it at the end of your kōrero around the minor and inconsequential amendments, and including the correct spelling of Māori. I'm just interested, and I accept that this is a decision that's already been made by the previous independent hearings panel, but I'm just interested in the rationale behind it, because I'm aware that Māori, M-A-U-R-I, let's just say the difference between Māori and Māori is dialectical. So the spelling M-A-U-R-I is a Tainui spelling. So that would relate to Ngāti Toa. and MOURI as a Taranaki dialectical difference there. So that would be the preference of Taranaki whānui. So I'm just wondering whether there was any consideration of the implications of that change for Ngāti Toa.
Yes, I can't speak to that call in terms of the recommendation, which I assume was made by Mr. McCutcheon as part of the first hearing stream,
Okay.
which then kind of for consistency, other topic leads flowed through.
Yeah, so it's a consistency issue.
But I think you raise a very good point, and I'd be interested to know in terms of what submission was made by Ngāti Toa on that, given the change in spelling. And I'm trying to recall myself why I included both. And I think it's because I was given advice probably way back when in terms of mana whenua engagement through their conduit, Ms. Wakaira, that including both, worked for both mana whenua. But yeah, I can follow up on that too in the writer reply as well to understand
Thank you.
the context.
That would be really helpful. So we would be, obviously there's a consistency issue there now for us to have to take into consideration, but are we sort of bound to accept the request, well, from Taranaki? I guess we're not. It's still a request from Taranaki whānui to change that spelling in respect of these particular provisions. So we're not bound to accept that, are we?
It's an interesting one in terms of the call being made by Mr. McCutcheon in stream 1,
Yes.
and then obviously flowed through, and then decisions have been made on that by the council last week. I'd have to do a bit more thinking on that in terms of respond to that, noting also what submission scope there was, and particularly from Ngāti Toa as well. But that's something I could look into.
Thank you. Appreciate that very much. And those are all the questions from me. Thanks.
Thank you. Some of my questions have been answered, but I would be grateful for some examples how the design guide does apply to, or could apply to, hospitals. Just a few would be useful. And I do note the introduction to the design guide clearly lists both the tertiary and the hospital zones as applicable. So it's not like it's sort of left silent in the design guides. And I will be asking both Southern Cross, wasn't it, and Victoria University about how they think it's not relevant, why they think it's not relevant. But just a related question, you said that a bespoke design guide for these institutions was considered or proposed or whatever at one point, but not pursued. Can you remember what the reasoning for that was?
Yes, I think it was probably just in terms of the early days of the issues and options review, and talking with consent planners and urban design team within council and the institutions as well. I think ultimately the reason it wasn't, and I should maybe take one step back, some of the feedback coming through that I received was that whilst it was a great document that has been very useful in terms of obviously kind of applying for consent, but also processing on council's behalf. My understanding was that not all guidelines were always looked at, addressed, or found to be that applicable due to the fact that the guides were quite old. Certainly one thing I can say is that you may have noticed that in the guides themselves they've got very blurry images of the site plans, so it's quite hard to actually see the maximum height limits in itself. So they are quite dated. And I think certainly retaining them was one option that was considered pre-draft plan draft plan release. But ultimately, I think the decision was made that this could be addressed through a policy, and it probably part of that kind of thought process of bringing it into the plan, possibly ensuring that all those considerations within the policy hook anyway, and then it was probably a matter of, what's left beyond the policies that's been kind of possibly pulled through in terms of existing policy, but also from the existing design guides. So kind of a thorough assessment was done of the guidelines from the operative plan looking at what other second generation plans were doing, and then whatever was left, it was possibly the call, if my memory serves me, that there wasn't enough to warrant a bespoke guideline, because actually the height controls were brought into the standards. The guidelines themselves were kind of incorporated into the policy, and there was a feeling that certainly some of the things around the urban design outcomes in the guidelines, in the guides themselves, kind of could be covered through the Centres and Mixed Use Design Guide. And I do appreciate that. Mystery possibly thinks that it's a bit of a long hook in terms of applying the Centres and Mixed Use Design Guide. That is her opinion, but certainly from my opinion, and having gone through the design guide review, I think there is applicability there, and I'm happy to obviously provide examples as part of writer reply. But yeah, it just was, I think, the ultimate call that it could be addressed within the chapter itself, and it wasn't needed anymore, and it kind of could be more consistent from that perspective. And I give maybe another example is looking at other special purpose zones, for example, with the change to zones rather than kind of precincts. A lot of the changes thinking about Tertiary as well, Tertiary precinct, any design guidance on that, things like the stadium zone as well. A lot of the kind of change under the planning standards was to bring things in-house into a bespoke chapter. So there was kind of a call that, in some of these other zones as well, that design guidance wasn't needed, individually, and in the case of the hospital and tertiary, that's the Centres and Mixed Use Design Guide could be relied upon with the associated stronger policy framework.
Thank you. The only other question I had was, there's a little bit of confusion on my behalf. So, and then you may not be in a position to know this or respond to it immediately, but I'm a little bit confused about the recommendations made in respect of Objective 3 to the hospital zone. The Southern Cross had submitted to add and hospital needs into that objective. But Ms. Hayes recommended actually adding hospital, but removing healthcare facility. So healthcare facility, the definition of healthcare facility actually excludes hospitals, specifically excludes hospitals. So I'm kind of left wondering, why not cover both? Because I'm aware, personally, that some of these hospitals do cover quite a wide range of healthcare facilities as listed in the definition of that term. Why is hospital needs of Wellington City and the region sufficient to cover all those other activities that are caught by healthcare facilities?
I'm glad you actually asked that question, because I was going to flag as well, probably should have done in my introduction notes, that there is unfortunately, the recommendation that Ms. Hayes has made in terms of actually following through into Appendix A hasn't been carried into, as Ms. Tree points out in her legal submission. I must admit, I initially thought, reading Ms. Tree's, that it covered both based on kind of the way her comments were worded about Ms. Hayes' recommendation. But having revisited, it does look like Ms. Hayes has advised striking out healthcare, as you note. I have revisited the definitions myself, and definitely, at minimum, hospital is needed, as you note, because healthcare facility excludes hospital. And certainly when I was drafting hospital, it's very abundantly clear that two definitions are needed, because while there probably is a bit of possibly an overlap with some services within healthcare, within the hospital, there's also quite a clear difference in terms of primary and ancillary. And possibly something that can be revisited at writer reply, but I did reflect this afternoon on whether actually both could be included in the objective. I'm just going to re-look at it one moment just to make sure, but I would. My only thought this afternoon was whether providing healthcare, whether it was an accident that was included within that as well, just because it clearly separates out hospital from that in terms of healthcare facility might be something that's anticipated in other zones, not within the hospital itself, in terms of, it might be a medical clinic or a GP or something like that, or other services provided in other zones. But I think certainly the possibility of including both needs to be explored, and something that can be addressed in writer reply as well. But I would have to double check the objective just to make sure that see if I can recall why, but I think possibly both need to be in it, from my opinion anyway.
Yeah, well, that was my initial thinking as well when I saw that and looked at the definitions of both. And I accept that there's big overlap between the two, but one, you provide a lot of healthcare facilities without necessarily providing hospital as such, like inpatient kind of facilities.
Definitely, and there's probably a bit of overlap in terms of, for example, regional hospital. There are healthcare facilities separately on the site, but not, so as well as hospital activities. So I will explore that in the writer reply in terms of just checking that there isn't something that I'm missing from that. But I think probably in retrospect, both could be applied, and I could also check with Ms. Hayes.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any further questions. Any further questions from the panel? No, not that. So I think that's it in terms of the hospital zone. Stevens?
Great.
So if you'd like everyone to turn attention to tertiary education zone. And cleverly I filed that right at the back end of my printed out copies.
I will also grab my notes from that. Does it suit the panel if I just briefly talk to the section 42A and rebuttal?
Yes, please. That would be helpful. Thank you.
Sure. So I think I covered quite a bit off in terms of there is that overlap between hospital and tertiary, particularly those changes that got carried through recommended to be carried through minor and inconsequential amendments by Ms. Hayes. How about just jump to... So again, Ms. Hayes has recommended minor amendments to the notified provisions of the tertiary education zone. So this covers the Victoria University's Calburn campus and Massey University's Mount Cook campus. I would just note for context, and I may have breezed over it before trying to keep my notes succinct, but in terms of reviewing this zone and then deciding on the extent of the tertiary education zone, the decision was made that no further institutions or campuses needed to be included within the zone. So the kind of starting point was, what is the institutional precincts and the operative plan cover, and then has there been any correspondence in terms of from Vic, for example, wanting to include their other campuses, so Pipitea or Gusney Street, for example. And based on stakeholder engagement, the institutions were happy with the campuses included, so Calburn and Mount Cook, and that they had a degree of comfort with the fact that these other campuses, so Victoria University, for example, are covered by the city centre zone, for example. So in terms of the extent, there was no change there in terms of notified plan, and then also very minor zoning change in terms of, I think the only one from memory was Massey in terms of rezoning the Wellington High School site to high density residential, and then a couple of corner sites for Massey. I think it's the old police station and another site on the corner to city centre zone. I'll note as well, just within the tertiary education zone, there's also a particular policy added for the National War Memorial to reflect that that is included within the tertiary education zone for Massey. So moving to the 42A, so one zoning change was recommended by Ms. Hayes in terms of section 42A report, and that she recommended that 320A, the terrace, so McLean Flats, owned by Victoria University, be rezoned from high density residential zone to tertiary education zone through the submission from Victoria University seeking this. Ms. Hayes has, however, rejected the submission point from Victoria University seeking to rezone 302 the terrace, which is owned by Wellington Electrical Lines Limited and contains a substation. I can take questions on that further, and I think it also comes up through rebuttal. Ms Hayes also rejected a request from Massey University to rezone 2 sections of the land zoned high density residential zone that is located to the north of the tertiary education zone for Massey. So these 2 sections at 249 Taranaki Street, Mount Cook, are occupied by Wellington High School and Community Institute and owned by the Crown. Massey was seeking that they would be within tertiary education zone, but Ms Hayes has rejected this zone request. So then moving to other changes, so the rule framework, so TED R6.2 and R7.2, so additions and alterations in construction. Similar to the hospital zone, Ms Hayes recommended that the design guide matter of discretion is struck out, and in light of that, policy references added to fulfil the intent of the Centres and Mixed Use Design Guide as per the ISPP provisions. And also the similar change made to the hospital in terms of servicing screening just adjoining the legal road, adjoining road. So being a bit more enabling within that matter of discretion. Ms Hayes has also recommended that for R6.2 and R7.2 that a notification statement is added that where activities comply with all 4 tertiary education zone standards, they're precluded from limited notification as per the submission point from Victoria University. Ms Hayes has also recommended a change to Standard 1, so the maximum height of buildings and structures, to Victoria University campus to include the recommendation to rezone 320A the terrace, so McLean Flats, to tertiary education zone, and that height control area 2, which is 34 metres, also be applied to areas within 320A the terrace that are located within 20 metres from the external boundary of the zone. So a change. Almost there. A change to also to standard 4, so the building coverage in relation to 320 the terrace, amendment to the title to also apply to 320A the terrace to match that of the Gordon Wilson flats. And the last change being Ms Hayes has recommended amendments to the definition of tertiary education facility as requested to include education and research partners as a primary anticipated activity within the zone. As well as food and beverage and retail activities as ancillary activities within the definition. So then moving to rebuttal, just to give a quick summary. So we'll note just actually in terms of the hospital zone, I note that there is now expert evidence from Mr. Paul from Southern Cross. However, that was not received in time to respond as part of rebuttal. Happy to take questions if there was, but one expert evidence has been received by Victoria University via planning expert Mr. Peter Coop. Mr. Coop's evidence sought, I'll just summarise very briefly, that the term cannot be achieved should be changed to is not achieved within the additions, alterations and construction rules, R6 and R7. That 302 the terrace still be rezoned from high density zone to tertiary and applicable changes made to standard 1 and 4 to reference this. And that the restricted discretionary activity status change to a controlled activity as per the operative plan approach for the adds and odds and construction rules. And that the reference to visible from public spaces in R6 and R7 permitted activity clauses be amended to are not visible from a legal road or located 10 metres away from a legal road boundary. Ms Hayes has agreed to one change, being that amending cannot be achieved to is not achieved within the rules 5 to 8, as per the panel's recommendations on the ISPP provisions. And no other changes to the chapters were recommended. And I might just say my last point, if I may, given the decisions by Council on the 14th of March, in terms of just any implications, I think I'll just note that during decisions was made, as the panel will be very aware of, during decisions made on the ISPP provisions, the Council voted to delist the Gordon Wilson's flat building. This has been referred to Minister Bishop for final decision on the heritage listing. And I note that there's no time frame for the MIS to make this decision. So it's cannot be determinative, it's hard to say, at the moment in terms of tertiary education zone. So I think that's the extent of my notes.
Okay, thank you for that. Just before I turn to the panel, just in respect of the late corporate evidence submitted by Southern Cross, I will make a point that it was received 8 days late. I accepted it because it didn't really add too much new information. It was mainly a recap of what Southern Cross Hospital is all about, plus agreement or acceptance of Section 42A report recommendations, and just a reiteration about the design guides, reiterating the point made in the submission, so which is why I accepted it, but I will make that point to Southern Cross when they appear before us. So thank you for that. With that, I will turn to the panel to see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Stevens. A very comprehensive overview of the issues in play here, in which there's probably not too many. You did mention the council's recommendation to the minister in relation to Gordon Wilson Flats. Does that, in terms of whether it's listed or whether it's not, am I right in assuming that there is no implications for the tertiary education zone provisions before us, whether it's listed or not?
So in terms of my interpretation, correct, that there is no change to particularly thinking the demolition controlled activity rule. I'm kind of happy to give my perspective on that. I think it still holds a lot of relevance, particularly thinking the matters of control. If Minister Bishop did choose to delist it, particularly thinking, sorry, I just have it in front of me. Things, for example, the preparation and implementation of demolition management plan, and particularly thinking there's kind of nice synergy with recording of the building prior to demolition and surrounding amenity effects as well. So certainly in terms of that decision, it's just focused on heritage and the status and doesn't affect the tertiary education zone.
Okay, thank you. And again on 320, the terrace, I have to say I had to read it about 3 times to work out how you got the height limits and how you got the coverage controls. Have you got a simple explanation of the rationale for the maps which are included in the rear of the zone provisions, particularly S4 and also S1 in relation to Victoria for the height limits?
Sure. And this again, just noting that it was Ms. Hayes' his kind of height analysis probably will be revisited and write a reply just to ensure I have captured it correctly, because I understand it was quite a thorough assessment. So I will have to lean on that as well in terms of a written follow-up. But my interpretation, and I hope I have got this correct from the 42A report, and I understand that Ms. Hayes had a lot of conversations with councils, internal urban designers around, changing, or I guess as per Victoria University's request to, my understanding is increase the height limits within the area in terms of McLean and Gordon Wilson area in terms of the element of the site closest to the terrace, was to provide more height limits. Provide more development capacity, increase height limit. Ms. Hayes, I know, just through discussions, was trying to make a decision around, is it appropriate in terms of enabling greater height, but also, as you've touched on just before, there's a lot of connection between S1, then also in terms of the setbacks and S3 building setbacks, and also S4 in terms of that site coverage as well. And how that all works together. And I believe, based on the latest Appendix A, as per the rebuttal evidence, that, well, actually I think it was still as per the 42, that Ms. Hayes has made the call that it can be increased to height control area so 34 metres within kind of, I guess, the middle portion of that part of the site, whilst still ensuring that the 20 metre separation was given effect to, in terms of just being sympathetic to surrounding high density residential zones. I think, I hope I'm correct in saying that part of kind of that consideration in recognising that, as Ms. Hayes kind of sets out the different options, was that the high density zone surrounding has increased in terms of height limits, so anticipated development capacity, and also city centre zone as well in terms of the recommendation for height thresholds as well. So I think it was probably a bit of a middle ground, landing on increasing the heights within the core of the site, but also then having, I guess, a bit of a step down in terms of being more sympathetic to surrounding sites. But I will also follow up and write a reply because I want to make sure I've got that correct.
Yeah, just my observation when I was having a look through this is that there appears to be some rationale for the height limits and the site coverage, but it wasn't explicitly clear how you got there.
Okay.
And was the owners of the property in terms of Victoria University, were they actively engaged in dealing with these pretty important parameters on development on that site?
Certainly in terms of, I can speak to kind of the original drafting time. I had a lot of engagement with Victoria University, and was aware of their development plan, obviously intentions for that portion in terms of it being kind of a gateway to the city. I haven't admittedly looked kind of at the plan again more recently, but I'm aware of the desire to redevelop. These, I would just note as well, these standards for 320 to the terrace, so Gordon Wilson, has been carried over from the operative plan. I remember looking at this in detail in terms of, are these standards still appropriate? Are the metrics still appropriate? And working closely with my urban design colleagues who felt that they were, given kind of the position of the site, its visibility from surrounding areas of the city, but also recognising that quite possibly the heights were going to go up surrounding it in terms of city centre and residential as well. And I guess definitely in terms of, just from my perspective, it was always about how can we be more enabling, which I certainly from a drafting perspective have tried to be through a bespoke chapter and the framework and policy direction and strategic direction recognition, but also managing adverse effects on the surrounding properties, because I'm aware of, I think it's 324 the terrace, for example, was a big residential development further down the terrace, and there's some other residential sites surrounding. So I'm aware of the increased height that's been sought through Mr. Coop's comments and the submission, but which I think Ms. Hayes has kind of given a section in part and given effect to some degree, but I suspect it might not be quite the full extent that Victoria are hoping for.
Okay, well, we'll hear from Mr. Coop tomorrow, I think, and I'll probably put the same series of questions to him about the workability and the pragmatism that has come in determining both S1 and S4 in particular. Now, so in terms of S4, the existing Gordon Wilson flats are sort of up against the hillside, and there's an area, the escarpment in behind. Was that escarpment a development constraint in the operative plan as well?
It was.
I hadn't looked at it. So that is basically saying that this is an area of the site, because it's so steep and because it's so visible, that there should be development limitations placed upon it because of that.
Correct. So I'll need, in terms of write a reply, I can do my best to revisit if there's any kind of original Section 32 type analysis for those provisions, because it is operative plan. So I would direct the panel to Appendix 4 of Chapter 9, which is titled Permitted Building Standards for 320 the Terrace, and does talk around kind of verbatim in terms of that escarpment sub-area, and it has the same percentage in terms of developability for with it outside of the escarpment versus within it, so the 50% versus 35%. That was reviewed, and there was kind of a comfort of carrying that forward in terms of the area, and I guess also possibly the unknowns with Gordon Wilson at the time, and also kind of at the time of drafting what Victoria University's plans were, or if there was any kind of possibility for reuse or redevelopment, that kind of thing, and residential. But it's my understanding, I don't know the history to how that came into the operative plan, and I'm certainly curious. I could try and understand more for the writer reply and address that, as well as obviously your point before about providing more of that rationale for where Ms Hayes has landed. I would note, and I hope I'm correct in remembering this, that, I mean, particularly looking at, for example, the operative plan, I think it's 10 metres height limit. And then there's the recession planes as well, which in terms of the 320 the terrace, the operative plan applies in a residential area recession planes where it abuts in a residential area. So certainly looking at things like the building recession planes and setbacks, trying to look at it in terms of, was there a way to be a bit more enabling? And I think possibly the recession planes from memory has been a way of doing that, in terms of, no doubt, since the opera plan and proposed plan, the recession planes and the what the more enabling recession planes in the proposed plan has been carried through for the 320 the terrace from memory. But yeah, it's an interesting one in terms of that. I guess it is based on topography, it's based on the visibility of the site, and particularly thinking it's quite visible from a distance, but I need to learn more in terms of that origins of it.
Okay, that's fair enough. Thank you for that. Mr. Coop, in his evidence, is reasonably strong on the fact that there should be a much more permissive approach for development within the sites itself, and with the design appearance focus really being only on those edges of the site. It's quite a large site, and the Kelvin campus overall is a very large site. So, was there ever thinking that because of the nature of the facility that there needs to be a little bit more of a permissive approach in terms of activity standards which apply to that site as opposed to any other site, say in the central area?
Yeah, and so just to clarify, when you say site, you mean the whole campus?
Yes,
rather than the lower portion. Yeah. Certainly.
Talking about the entire campus now.
Yeah, and look, I understand Mr. Kurt's perspective in terms of what was the approach in the operative plan, and it certainly has been in terms of my previous involvement as topic lead, it certainly was ongoing conversations and desire by Vic for a controlled activity status as opposed to restricted discretionary. And I'm happy to speak to that point in particular, but I guess I would note generally it is, and putting to one side the restricted discretionary activity status, it is a more enabling framework in terms of there's more recognition not only in the objectives and policies but also the strategic direction of the plan, but also in terms of there's been increased height limits, and that process was done through looking at what are the actual heights, where can we allow a bit more height whilst also managing the height across the site, so more appropriate in this area because of visibility versus in the centre of the site, for example, and then also the things like setbacks and recession planes being more enabling, but also managing adverse effects, potential adverse effects on the residential. So I would note that the heights have increased, so there's a bit more flexibility in that. In terms of, I would also note that the rule framework is more enabling of kind of ancillary activities, for example. So under the operative plan, because it just wasn't set out, it particularly wasn't unique to the tertiary education zone, it was more general provisions. The feedback I got was that a lot of these ancillary activities got caught and needed a controlled activity when it was quite unnecessary to do so. So, bringing a lot more into the primary activities and ancillary into the definition and then making it a permitted activity has enabled a lot more, in my opinion. So an example being, this is more hospital, but there was the cycleway, for example, and I think that triggered a need for a consent when it was just a path through to provide more accessibility and staff function and things like that. It's probably not the best example, but certainly there's been things where it wasn't necessary possibly to require consent in terms of design consideration or visibility and things like that. I know that in my opinion, a bit of a win is that the maintenance, so building maintenance and repair is a permitted activity, so that's a big one in terms of minor works. In the past, you'd have to get a consent possibly for a window replacement or something like that, in terms of that it was quite restrictive in that operative plan, but it's been kind of, I guess, a middle step in terms of trying to be more enabling for minor works, but also acknowledging that there is still that provision for public visibility. I know that is certainly an area that Mr. Coop wants to be removed, but I'm on the same page as Ms. Hayes in terms of I haven't seen any evidence or kind of analysis from Mr. Coop in terms of why 10 metres is appropriate. And I also know in terms of this change, I assume he's seeking, where it's more than 10 metres, it shouldn't need consent in terms of adds and alts from the road. But I think possibly akin to thinking back to the wind topic, I'd want more analysis to understand why 10 metres was appropriate. In the wind case, it was 20 metres, but I think the area is highly accessible. There are a lot of public spaces, but there's also areas where it might not be visible that you could do works to the back of buildings, for example, without needing consent. And I will just note, if I can, sorry, I appreciate going on a bit, but if I could just note in terms of the activity status, I appreciate that Victoria University is seeking a controlled activity as per the operative. I agree with Ms Hayes in terms of her rebuttal that that was the approach of the operative plan, but it's not kind of council's approach. It's not a continual theme. I think a lot of work has been done in terms of bringing the operative plan to evolving from the operative plan in terms of new provisions, new approach in terms of based on a lot of things, conversations, consent reviews, national planning standards, for example. So there's no kind of this is council's approach and it's going to stay from the operative plan. I think a lot of things have changed. And I think there's enough enabling provisions within the tertiary that restricted discretion is appropriate. But Mr. Coop is not in his rebuttal, but I suspect he's also looking at the hospital zone for Wellington Regional Hospital, which is a controlled activity. And as Ms Hayes has noted, generally the new plan has gone towards not having controlled activities and more restricted discretionary. So if you look at other special purpose zones, stadium, I had a little look before, stadium, port, corrections, for example, there in terms of adds and alts and construction rules, those are restricted discretionary and generally not controlled. But I think in terms of the hospital, I have more comfort with that being a controlled activity, certainly compared to private hospitals and also tertiary in terms of the function the hospital provides. That's kind of national regional importance, the vital services in terms of operation and function. And I think in that case it is appropriate the hospital is controlled. But for tertiary, I think restricted discretionary is still enabling, but it just means that there's more things to consider, and I have comfort with that.
Yeah, and
sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, that's that is useful, but obviously, potentially a restricted discretionary activity can be turned down as well. And the main focus is that it's all about design and appearance, and which is still a factor with controlled activity, but you can't physically, a decision maker can't physically turn it down as a controlled activity.
Yeah.
Can only impose reasonable conditions. So that is the difference, and it is interesting, and it is something I did pick up that with the regional hospital site, there's way more flexibility than there is for a campus the size of Kelvin. In terms of not flexibility, but in terms of a easier consenting pathway for them. But,
yeah.
Well, we'll talk to Mr. Coop more about that when we see him.
Definitely, and look, I appreciate it's a point of contention for Mr. Coop and Victoria University. I did at one point, I think from memory, the hospital, it was a restricted discretionary and then decision made for controlled, based on kind of the reasons I canvassed. But I certainly would think that, in terms of, you are correct, restricted discretionary provides the ability to possibly turn down an application if, due to bulk form, it creates significant adverse effects that can't be mitigated or aren't being proposed to be mitigated. But generally, my answer is that it's a more enabling, and in terms of, the policy framework behind it, and there's more design considerations, particularly under, I think it's P6 now, tertiary education zone as well.
Hi. More of a minor one on the Massey University campus, where Massey University are looking at the two sites, which are actually part of the Wellington High School designation, I understand.
Correct.
But they're not being used for secondary school purposes anymore. They're part of the wider complex of Massey University there. So in terms, putting aside the designation for now, but looking at the use of those properties, is there an argument that they should actually, the zoning should be more reflective of the use, as opposed to being contrary to the purpose of the designation potentially?
I mean, I appreciate that in terms of, the argument of how it's actually used. But I kind of did accept and, agree with where Ms Hayes' land in terms of designation, and possibly also just having not heard from, I guess in terms of the site ownership, from Wellington High School, or I guess it's owned by the Crown, but, there's no input in terms of submissions from the high school itself, for example. But I understand in terms of, obviously, if it's a tertiary education zone, that would provide, would be more enabling of those activities that are already occurring within those portions of the site. It might be something that Brian Apply, whether that's myself or Ms Hayes, can revisit. But yeah, it would be certainly good to hear from Massey University in terms of the uses of that site further, and if there's anything restricting them in terms of if being within the being within those zones, given that it's adjacent Wellington High School site.
Yeah, we probably don't have too many submissions. We don't have any input from the Ministry of Education or the high school itself. But, and it is a designated site, which for, I presume, to secondary education purposes or education purposes. So at the end of the day, it probably doesn't matter too much. The one thing I do observe is why Wellington High School has got an underlying zoning of general residential, where the sites adjoining it to the north and south have the tertiary education zone as an underlying zone. And I don't think we can do anything about that. I don't think there's any submissions at all on it, but I just observe that it appears to be potentially a bit of an oddity.
I appreciate that. I kind of possibly tend to agree with you on that. When I think it's city centre zone across the way to the north, and then obviously tertiary surrounding it. And
the form and function of those buildings and activities on that site do not lend themselves to a residential type use. They are bespoke education buildings, so it's very much a side issue as far as I'm concerned. But make that observation.
It's a very good point, and I remember thinking about this at the time of drafting, and I'm struggling in terms of thinking about conversations with the residential topic leaders of why it stayed that way. But it's certainly something that could be, obviously it would depend on all parties, but it could possibly be revisited in the future in terms of is something like a, city centre zone or another zone more appropriate in terms of given surrounding land use and densities as well.
Yeah, it depends how much energy there is to actually do it as well, because it is a designated site, so it has its own own provisions which apply to a designated site.
Exactly, but I guess there hasn't, as far as I'm aware, there wasn't appetite or request from Ministry of Education, but I'd have to review that.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. No further questions.
Nothing further from me. Thanks, Ms Stevens.
Okay, just on that point, I just noticed on the planning maps that the college sites near the Mount Victoria Tunnel, they've got an underlying zoning of high density residential. So I don't know whether it's just a consistent approach being taken to education facilities in the city area. Yeah.
It would make, certainly in terms of, I think that did come to my head in terms of a lot of the other high schools and things like that are zoned, as far as I can recall, residential. I think, Wellington Girls College, Wellington College, for example. So it's probably just a consistent approach, like you say.
Yeah, okay. I think most of the questions have answered. Just a question of plan drafting, really. So it's very minor. In respect of the definition, the definition of tertiary education facility, Ms Hayes accepted the submission from Victoria University to add in education and research partners to the list of activities and facilities, because that's the term used above. But and then it's just semantics, really. But education and research partners isn't an activity or a facility as such. It's a,
I did.
I don't know,
Yeah.
thing.
I
It's
think
not
I
an
did pick up on
activity.
that as well. Yep.
Yeah, okay. so-
that can be explored. I might
Just-
put some
yeah.
thinking to that as part of the writer reply of terminology there. But I think you raise a good point. Obviously, that was taken, I think, if my memory serves me right, verbatim from the submission request.
Yeah.
But I think something like education and research partners facilities or
something like that,
activities
yeah.
or something like that. Yep. Okay, that's a
Just
good
be
point to note.
consistent.
Yep.
Kind of point.
Drafting.
Thank you.
Cool. I will follow on that up. Thank you. And other points raised during today.
I don't have any further questions. Any other questions arising? No, thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Stevens. We will let you get on with your evening there. And thank you for coming in virtually and for covering for Ms. Hayes as well. Our sympathy goes out to her. So we will adjourn the hearing. It's 10:10 here. We'll come back and hear from Mr. Beavis and Mr. Wright in half an hour's time. So 10:40. Okay. Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. No? Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Hearing Stream 7 has been reconvened to conclude our sessions with council officers, reporting officers. Our final two topics to do with light and temporary activities. And we have Mr. Beavis here, and to support him on the matter of light is Mr. Wright. Thank you, welcome. We've received your evidence and read it, thank you. As per the normal format, Mr. Beavis, we sort of hand over to you just to talk to your report, key points, and any recommendations that may have changed in particular since the report was circulated. So we'll hand over to you, and then we'll may have some questions for you. Okay.
Cool. Thank you, Commissioner Schofield. Kia ora. Just as an introduction, because I haven't been before you before, I'm Hayden Beavis. I'm an advisor in the district planning team. I'm the author of the Light and Temporary Activities Section 42A reports. And also, since Ms. Stevens' departure, I am the reporting officer for View Shafts. My role today is that I've been an expert in planning, and my full qualifications and experience is set out in my Section 42A report, and I confirm that I continue to comply by the Environment Court practice in 2023. As noted, I am supported by Mr. Glenn Wright, who's a principal at Stevenson Internal Limited. He provided expert evidence on the light chapter, and he'll be available for questions as necessary. I'm happy to take my Section 42A as read. I didn't receive any evidence from submitters on this matter, so I haven't provided any supplementary evidence, although there is one change to my recommendations, which I'll outline in my key changes. So in terms of key changes, I've noted that there isn't a huge amount in the chapter. It's mainly wording amendments, but there was also an amendment to external standards in light S1 and S6, which I did on the basis, which did not have submission scope, and I did on the basis of them being minor changes. But upon legal advice, I think it's probably best that this is addressed through a future plan change, as it didn't go through the process of documents incorporated by reference through the RMA. Beyond that, my recommendations for the chapter remain the same. I'm happy to provide some context on the chapter, but if you guys are happy to go to questions, and happy to go from there too.
Thank you. Turn to the panel. Commissioner Black.
The battery might have died. Oh, there we go. Again, I'm on. I just had one question about it when you made changes to the thanks, Jess, changes to avoiding the word use of the word conflict and gone for effects. But you haven't taken that through to P6.2. I just wondered, I thought perhaps it should be consistent with that. So S2.2, you've got conflict with established uses. I thought you would be better to reword that to be consistent with your other recommended changes that it said. The effects.
Yeah, I agree that consistency of the language would be useful, and I would be open to that change. It's just I thought I might be kind of limited by submission scope, because I think the submitter, which I believe was Weil, only.
Sorry, what's that?
I think the submitter, which I believe was Wellington International Airport, in the matter, only made that submission reference to one or two of the standards, I believe. I need to confirm that, but I mean,
It might be consistent language.
yeah, I mean, if you're happy that it's like a considered minor amendment, then I'm happy with those changes as well.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, just a couple of questions. Your reference to the change in the standard 2023 to 2019 might be for Mr. Wright to answer, but what's the difference between the two, and is it significant?
Yeah, I might defer to Mr. Wright on that matter. He'd be more of an expert.
I'd probably term the differences between the two as the latter standard was a further refinement building on the 2019 version. So it's providing a bit more guidance on a number of topics there, but with regards to the parts of the standard that are being referred to in the lighting chapter, there is the limits that are in there. lighting technical parameter limits, they remain unchanged between the two versions. Probably the key change is there's a bit more guidance on the lighting standard S6, which was to do with the luminous limits. And so there we're dealing with the brightness of facades on buildings typically. And because the previous standard didn't have sufficient guidance on how that should be assessed, hence there was the reference to CI to a different standard, CIE. So from, it would be a lot cleaner and probably best practice for the assessment of compliance with rule S6 being referring back to 4282 standard and the new version of that.
It's a bit of a wider issue, but there is a theory that if a New Zealand standard gets updated, then the plan should automatically get updated to reflect that. I know you don't have any submissions on it, but I'm just wondering whether this might be a case for a minor amendment. I don't know what, I haven't discussed that with my colleagues at all, but it seems like you have a definitive New Zealand standard which has been updated, which replaces the previous version, which is referenced. It's done New Zealand standards. There's a whole lot of process to actually get to where they are, and in terms of expertise involved in development and updating of those. But it would seem, instead of having to put it to your first plan change one when to tidy up things which have been raised, that there might be a case to be made that it's a minor amendment.
As a lighting practitioner who's carrying out, a lot of assessments of lighting and stuff, I agree that would be the best scenario, because while we look at district plan rules for permitted activity standards and stuff, we often also refer to 4282 as well, and because obviously there are some aspects in a district plan which aren't as it's difficult to cover them as well as you can in a standard that's specifically written to address effects, and so even if you had 2019 in there as a lighting practitioner, you'd be pulling out your latest version as a reference.
Okay. The other one, and it's much more general question, is lighting is quite a technical subject. There's only a certain range of individuals that have expertise in it. I'm just wondering about your routine resource consent process and somebody who's going to apply for routine resource consent. Are they always going to have to go to a specific lighting person to actually say, yes, we comply with the standards, or is there a quicker and easier applicant's route to navigate through these rules?
Mr. Wright might be able to speak to this further, but from my understanding, it isn't necessarily always the case that a lighting engineer will be required for implementing some of these standards, but I'll defer to Mr. Wright again for that matter, because he's more experience.
The limits that are within being proposed in the district plan, I wouldn't deem them to be.
So could a good architect navigate their way through them?
Yes, I think the difference would be where he was doing something a bit more intense and he was close to a light sensitive area. That would be where he'd be, but through the selection of appropriate fittings that fundamentally control the light anyway, he would.
And how does this set of provisions compare or contrast with similar plan provisions elsewhere? is there a general consistency of approach? It's certainly for you, Mr. Wright. You may know what's happened in Pororua, for example, who's been through the recent process.
Yes, so I guess my experience in starting with district plans and stuff was when Auckland became a super council, and so there was the Auckland Unitary Plan, and I was fortunate enough to be engaged by Sports New Zealand to make a submission against that lighting chapter, and the lighting chapter that was proposed was quite flawed. They just picked the Auckland Isthmus Plan rules because the council planner, that was what he was familiar with. And so I put on the table the CIE standards at the time, which were, from my research and stuff, was the only thing that was really addressing glare, which I personally see as the primary obtrusive effect of lighting. And when I presented those standards, their lighting expert and planner immediately said, yes, this is what we want. And they took them on board. Some years, 2017, when the New Zealand Australian standard was updated, it was interesting to see that they aligned their limits to that same standard. And that, so when I was involved technical advisor for the Porora proposed district plan lighting chapter there, and for that, yeah, I primarily made reference to the Australian New Zealand Standard 4282.
So what's in the Porora plan is pretty reflective of what is being proposed here.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree as well. Yeah, in my research, yeah, I believe there is a slight difference in one of the standards, but it's mostly aligned with what's in 4282.
Okay. Yeah, common approach to a common issue, I think is, yeah. Okay, thank you. No further question.
Yeah, they're just, so just, they're not as restrictive as some. Yeah, like 2 lux is 3 lux sometimes is a typical spill that we see in some of the older standards out there. And unfortunately, some of the refreshes of district plans have just rolled those over without any consultation with the industry. Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Hi, kia ora, tēnā kōrua. Mr. Wright, I think you might be the best, well, I'm not sure, completely over to you two as to who might be the best person to answer this first very broad question. It's in relation to paragraph 52 and the reference there to artificial lighting installations and the impact that those could potentially have on the night sky. And I note the reluctance there to impose restrictions of that nature through the PDP for cost reasons and other constraints that may result. I was just really wondering what the International Dark Sky Association status is, and I guess to what extent we are, or Wellington City Council is obligated, if at all, to adopt or work towards perhaps adopting those kinds of standards and requirements in future to optimise the night sky that we potentially do have available to us to benefit from, and other species as well who might benefit from that. And I mean, at what point, if at all, are we likely to get to the point of being able to achieve that status if it's at all necessary? I'd just be interested in your general views about that.
Yes, so I've had quite a bit of involvement in that space. I am an IDA member, or International Dark Sky Association member, and that, but I was engaged for South Wairarapa Council to help with their dark sky reserve application.
Mm.
And so to get those classifications, you have to have basically have district plan rules that align with what they call the dark sky light ordinance.
Right.
And those light ordinance change depending on the category of whether it's a reserve or a sanctuary and stuff. So I'm also working with Kaikoura District Council, they're going for a sanctuary, and so that has some extra little twists on illuminated signs and
Yes, right.
other bits and pieces there.
So were they able to achieve the standard over in the Wairarapa? through
Yes,
the
yes, they
district
were.
plan? Wow.
And stuff, but I guess so the sort of things you have to change in your rules is like you bring in a requirement for the lighting that comes out of light fittings to be a special colour.
Right.
So 2700, which is a warmish colour. It's sort of akin to what your incandescent lamp would provide, as opposed to some of the whiter light here. And with an ideal of taking that even lower to almost becoming the old orange sort of light. So that's a fundamental change, and of course associated with that, some people will argue that that's putting a cost on that lighting solution, but the actual industry can provide those different colour temperatures at no premium generally within their range, in the better quality products in their range. Limits on how you can project light, and so you limit that a light fitting cannot project anything above the horizontal, and ideally 10% below.
Yeah.
Is another factor. They like to bring in lighting controls as well, so that movement so the lighting's only on when required.
Yes.
I think there's some other, and then there's there's another side to it. For example, for Kaikoura, I'm also involved with a rezoning, a developer that's rezoning a piece of rural land into industrial. And so we've worked beside the local dark skies community and group, and they brought a whole lot of best practice lighting principles. And so we took those on board and said, yep, we can do what the activities we want to do in this zone and apply to those rules. And so I suggested that they brought on a lighting management plan to deal with that. But as it transpired, because they were creating a zone that didn't exist in their district plan at all, they were able to roll them all into the lighting rules for that zone.
Just for that zone.
Just for that zone. Yeah. So I guess the reason why we haven't proposed to adopt any additional stuff is that I think that you probably have to go through another notification process and another Section 32 report to.
Yes. So there'd have to be a good reason for it, I guess. Maybe something similar to what you've suggested is happening elsewhere.
Yeah, and it's tricky in Wellington's such a big city. There is so much incidental light that is going skyward, because the whole premise behind quality of night sky is that as you send light up, you start brightening the sky, and so the contrast between the brightness of the sky and the bright light source becomes diminished, so you get less bright stars when you're looking up there. Yeah. With the change in technology now to LED, or Wellington having changed all its streetlights, there's been a significant improvement there.
Is it possible, do you think, for a city such as Wellington over time to achieve those kinds of changes that you're talking about, to reduce the light spill down to the minimum required to meet this kind of standard?
Probably not, just because of the high commercial sort of element there. And you've probably got a lot more activity that occurs that requires outdoor lighting
Mm.
than some of these other areas. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you. Thanks for enlightening me on that. That's really interesting. But it doesn't have any bearing, unfortunately, on the next question, which is in relation to the provisions themselves. And going to objective 2, light 202, adverse effects of outdoor artificial lighting. The adverse effects of outdoor artificial lighting on sensitive areas, traffic safety, aviation safety, coastal wildlife, and the night sky are limited. So my first question is around the coastal wildlife, and just try to understand what the intention is here. Is the objective intended to be limited to birds, or does it include all wildlife inhabiting the coast?
So the reason why the provisions regarding the coastal margin were brought in was because Greater Wellington Regional Council have identified the entire coastal margin as sensitive bird habitat.
Yes.
And there is also the guidance, which is noted in the introduction, about
Yes.
lighting surrounding
Right.
bird life. So that sort of gave a good evidential basis for including that in the objective policies and the rule as well. So that's why it's specific to coastal wildlife.
Yes. So, okay, so the intention is that it covers not just birds then, but marine turtles, and I think the rest of birds. Is that right? And would it be any other wildlife that inhabits the coastal margin?
Presumably the lighting controls would help with other wildlife as well, although I'll note that I'm an ecologist, so that might be incorrect, but also okay, I'll defer to Mr. Wright.
Yeah, just having read the document that is referred to in the note in the opening introduction, that particular national lighting guidelines from Australia is being adopted within the lighting industry, and so I'm quite familiar with it. And so its focus its key principles are that human beings need light. So the purpose of the guidelines isn't to exclude lighting, it's to still allow those activities to occur, but to provides a whole lot of guiding principles that will help reduce the impact on wildlife, and specifically wildlife that is endangered.
Yes.
So that's typically where we see that people are coming to us and saying, you know, we want to do this activity, but we've got little blue penguins, for example, or a particular rare seabird.
Yes. I understand. Thank you. Just on that point, why are we limiting ourselves to coastal species that are at risk, declining and threatened?
It kind of goes back to my previous point about how there was quite a strong evidence base based on that guidance, and also the identification of the coastline as sensitive bird habitat by the regional council.
Yes.
So it's not necessarily that it was, I suppose in a way it kind of was prioritized because there was the evidence base there, but yeah, we didn't have.
So I'm just thinking about the native bird species, for instance, in Zealandia, who obviously inhabit an area some distance away from the coast, but there are bird species in there obviously that have the same threatened and vulnerable status as some of those shorebirds and seabirds. Is there potential for the birds in Zealandia, for instance, being adversely affected from artificial lighting?
It's a very good question, a tricky one in that, typically when we're considering the effects, we're sort of looking at a number of things, like some it's to do with the animal itself, just the sensitivity to light, and so you're
Mm.
causing an obtrusive effect to them, a personal discomfort, but it doesn't have an impact on their it doesn't have a mortality associated with it. But
Right.
the things that do have a mortality associated are where they're getting disorientated,
Yes. Yeah.
and that because of the artificial light, or in some cases like in Kaikoura, they have a problem with the one of the rare seabirds there, and on a wet day, the combination of wet ground and street lighting, to them, it's quite often perceived as the sea again, and they have a lot of crash landing that occurs, and they think it's sea, and they hit there, and they knock themselves out or kill themselves. So it's interrupting those movements
see.
or disorientating birds is one part, and then the other side is the predator side of things.
Yeah.
And that's it's if you look at the whole life cycle of everything that's living out there in nature, there's pros and cons.
Yeah.
Some benefit from light, some
Yes. Yeah.
are not. But my first foray into assessment of lighting effects was actually Rugby League Park when Wellington Rugby put in some sports lights there, and there was a great concern about moorporks in the green belt that was adjacent that, and the outcome of that one was that the moorpork was very urbanised,
Mm.
and so it wasn't quite so sensitive to the levels, and because of its habitat, the green belt, it was able to move
Yes.
if it found
Move away
that
from the
yeah.
the light source. I see. So your opinion would be that there may not be potentially, adverse effects to the extent they might be life-threatening on native bird species within the Zealandia sort of habitat, because they're less likely to become disoriented from artificial lighting.
Yeah, I think in their case, it's probably more of whether there was a predator issue.
Yeah.
And, that's their biggest threat in there. It's the fencing and.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's really helpful. So there's no, you're comfortable without any reference to, the birds or the wildlife within, say, Zealandia needing any special sort of mention or protection through these provisions?
Sympathetic to the point, but we weren't really provided evidence specific on that. But I will note that there is the light spill standard as well, which would limit the amount of light that can carry over to like an adjacent site as well, which would help as well. So,
thank you. So just those last couple of words in that objective, adverse effects are limited, and I was just wondering about the rationale behind the choice of limited and other similar objectives and policies relating to other zones. There are different words that are chosen. Minimised is one and managed effectively is another. But I haven't seen anywhere else where limited has been used, and I just wondered what the rationale was there.
I think part of the reason why it's drafted that way is because trying to be more permissive of outdoor artificial lighting, but
Right.
I didn't draft this chapter, so it might be better if I come back to you and write a reply on that one, just a bit further research just to find out if there's any good reasoning for the choice of words there.
Thank you. And how do you, sort of limited in relation to what? I mean, how do you measure that? Postal. And then just very quickly, light R2, where you set out the matters of discretion there. Bird species, will that make sense now? I think that's covered. Oh, that's right. I was just wondering, I mean, in relation to species that are at risk, threatened or endangered, is the light P2 intention to minimise effects on those endangered species. Is that sufficient? Does that provide sufficient protection, do you think, for those endangered species that might be impacted by artificial lighting in the coastal margin?
Probably need to get back to you on whether it's sufficient, but I think, again, it's similar to that previous point on
Yes.
limited, where it's trying to be still permissive of lighting in the coastal margin, but it's just trying to account for the fact
I
that there
do
are-
understand that, but I'm just wondering in relation to birds that are, you know, threatened and endangered, vulnerable, is that a sufficient level of, does that offer a sufficient level of protection, I guess? And I'm happy for you to come back on that one.
Yeah, I'd have to get back to you on that one or reply.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
just to comment on that because of, the familiarity of the format of this chapter is, I guess it's, the rules have been presented based on the various zones and their level of sensitivity, are the ambient and lighting conditions that they're already experiencing and trying to provide limits that relate to that. So obviously
Yeah,
if you're
I
in
see.
a rural area, you'll want a lot less if permitted lighting levels are a lot less and a lot more controlled. And so one thing I did identify is that in those zones, you don't have a zone category that you could then address for those margins.
Yeah.
I don't know how the zoning
Mm.
maps or such work.
The coastal margin is defined in the plan.
So it's whether you implemented another, how it has all various zones, and then you had another section which was the coastal margin, and then you would implement the limits that are recommended by the same as Australian New Zealand Standard 4282 for it has an A0 lighting zone, which is basically a rural area with no road lighting.
Right.
So it's intrinsically very dark. And so then you could apply limits to those boundaries.
Okay. Thank you. So that's feasible within the coastal margin of the Whanganui-Atara?
So could you clarify that as well?
That to achieve that standard that Mr. Wright's just referred to in the coastal margin, that's provided within the guidance for installing and assessing lights in coastal wildlife habitats from Australia, those rules.
Yeah.
Is that, I mean, are we already meeting those standards now? Or, I mean, is it feasible to, to minimise the artificial lighting in those environments to the extent necessarily to meet these guidelines?
Coastal margin, it's a pretty thin sliver, so it's the 10 metres from the mean high at Water Springs. But I guess, do you have any comments, Mr. Wright?
What we're seeing out there, because I've been involved with a number of these shared pathways.
Yeah.
So the Nauranga Petone and then the one that's currently under construction at Eastbourne.
Yeah.
And that there, we have been applying that very reference guideline to those. And in particular, there was a reserve in Eastbourne where there was, little blue penguins were identified as crossing that path to get to their nesting. And we came up with lighting that minimise those impacts. But in the end, the community engagement was very strong about the impact on those little blue penguins. And in the end, they took the path, they kept it on the road margin in lieu of going through that reserve. So they eliminated the problem altogether.
That's a really helpful example. Thank you. Because I was thinking about, the proximity of our coastal margin here in Wellington to the motorway and obviously a lot of artificial lighting that's happening along there. And whether or not it was feasible to be imposing this standard for the protection of wildlife, but it seems as though we're already doing that.
Yeah, as a further example, because I'm involved in the lighting design for the Nauranga Petone, and that there, yeah, we have lighting that cuts off at the path.
Yeah.
It's very, very precise controlled lighting. So we're minimising what's going to the sea. And then what they have there is they have a series of 6 uranga, which are like little bays where you can stop and rest. And in those we have lighting, but we've gone to this 2,200 very warm colored light, and we've got lighting that we can fine tune where we're projecting it. So yes, we have considered that there too.
Thank you very much. No further questions.
Thank you. Just to pick up on Commissioner Pomare's questioning there. There would be a question of scope, obviously, but is there scope to look at applying that AS0, did you say?
A0.
Yeah, A0.
Environmental zone A0.
Right, to the coastal margin, given the objectives of the plan and fin lighting. I know you said it's the coastal margin is defined as 10 metres from the CMA boundary, is that right?
Yeah. It's all land within the horizontal distance, 10 metres landward from the coastal marine area.
Yeah. Because I'm looking at the standards and I can't see anything unless you can point me to it that's specific to the coastal margin in terms of the lighting standards.
Oh, that's based on the R2, which is outdoor artificial lighting in the coastal
Right.
margins. That's how to tie it to that spatial extent.
But the actual standard for, the limits and things for lighting.
Are you referring to the zone boxes? And,
Yeah,
I see.
yeah. I can't see anything that's specific to the coastal margin, and even the rural one. I don't know if that's the rural one there is the A0, following the A0 standard.
I think the rural one is maybe A2.
A2, right.
So A2 is low district brightness. It's sparsely inhabited rural, semi-rural areas.
Right.
And then we go to a next higher one, which is A1, which is a dark environment. And
Right.
it's relatively inhabited rural areas, no road lighting unless specifically required by road controlling authority. And then we get to the A0, which is intrinsically dark, which is the UNESCO Starlight Reserve Dark Sky Parks. That's the thing. So I was probably incorrect in saying AO. It's probably A1s because of the urban nature of Wellington and those coastal margins. That
Right.
A1 would be the sensible one to be looking at.
I just wonder whether through reply, Mr. Beavis, you could address that question of Commissioner Pomare's more specifically as to how it would or may not apply coastal margins.
Yeah, so as an example, that would give you an after a curfew, so overnight after 11 PM, it would give you a 0.1 lux spool lighting level and a brightness of 500 candelas, which are levels that you really are mitigating effects on anyone in that area.
Right. Okay. Well, that may be the answer then. Just going back to basics, and I think this is picking up on a question from Commissioner Dash about how this would be implemented, because this is quite a step change from the ODP lighting controls, is it?
Yeah. So the ODP was a bit so it's contained within the zone chapters, I believe, and there was no specific objectives or policies, if I remember correctly.
Right.
And there was a rule that was sort of generalized, and I think there was a rule tied to them. I don't have them up in front of me, but can provide that at some point. But also, Mr. Wright, do you have any insight on?
Yeah, they were very limited and problematic. Like basically interpreting the city centre had no protection. It was primarily focused around limiting the impact of sports lighting. They came and they sat within the open plan, open space rules, but they had been sort of adapted as being, because that's where the only limit was. They were adapted as the limit that would apply to all. So they were just providing protection for residential properties.
Yeah.
And so they were adopted as the rules for every instance where you were building a supermarket or something and you had an interface with a residential property.
Right.
So yeah,
Okay.
very, very limited. And the glare rule was particularly poor. It basically said you should not be able to see the light source.
Mm.
When obviously you look out your window and you'll always see the light source on street light, for example. And so whenever we did an assessment, we always had to point out that problem, and then we would present the limits of AS 4282 as what should be the permitted activity level.
Right. Okay. And in terms of application, I'm presuming, and again, this is a question from Commissioner Dash, that in some degree, there is a corollary with noise, and that a lot of this wouldn't apply unless there was a nuisance being created, and that, you know, there was an investigation, a compliance check and things around that, and then you would apply this quite a lot, unless there was a specific proposal where it sort of, excuse the pun, became glaringly obvious that there could be a light problem. Would that be your understanding, that generally this is kind of a nuisance-based standard for, by and large?
Yeah, I guess it probably would be, nuisance based, but also probably better for Mr. Wright to speak to in practice when people are designing lighting systems, to what degree they consider this, but yeah, so maybe defer to Mr. Wright on that latter part.
Yeah, when we're designing lighting systems for to permit new activities generally to occur or improve what can be done with the lighting. We design lighting systems to meet the permitted standards, and when we don't, and generally my experience is when we design to those levels, we have very few complaints.
Right.
And that, like, primarily for me, my experience is probably sports field, and that I've probably done over well over 100 sports fields across New Zealand and stuff. New technologies, LED have definitely made it easier now, and we're putting more intense lighting closer to residential boundaries and stuff. But yeah, it does go often, if you're introducing light to a sports field that wasn't lit previously, you then also have your acoustic consideration that has to be presented as well.
That's the sort of situation I imagine where you would think, your little red light would light up saying this could be a potential issue. We need to make sure that it complies, versus a standard residential development where you would just assume that they could comply, unless proved otherwise or less told otherwise. But yeah, okay, thank you. The standards that list the zones, I would just, this is just a minor point, it might be worthwhile, Mr. Beavers, just going through those, because I think there's a little bit of inconsistency. Like large lot residential's being changed in standard 1, but it doesn't seem to come through the other standards, and it talks about metropolitan zones rather than metropolitan centre zones and things like that. So might just be worthwhile just.
Yeah, that was a mistake on my part, not amending the remainder of the large lot residential zones, but also a good point about the metropolitan centre zone. I can go through and amend those titles necessary.
Okay. There was one in your assessment of the Ministry of Education. This is paragraph 116. You said the use of the term conflict is unclear and not used in other assessment criteria, but just in the preceding one before that, there is a criteria where it uses conflict, and you're recommending saying any conflict with established uses. So,
Is it middle raised?
yeah, so that's S2, is it?
Yes,
Yes, S2. You're recommending adding any conflict with established uses. But with S3, you want to delete conflict with existing sensitive activities.
That may have been me not carrying it over because I thought there might be scope issues, but
Okay.
if it could be considered like a minor amendment, then I'm happy to carry those through as well. Because I think the consistency of language would be higher priority.
Okay. Right. I think that's all of the questions I have. Hang on. The final question for me, just in terms of your evidence, Mr. Wright, in paragraph 16, in response to the docs submission, I think this relates back to the discussion we had before. If SNAs were in a zone within the PDP, then the AS recommendations for environmental zone A1 could be considered as appropriate. Does that sort of relates to the questions we had before? So I think it could be considered appropriate. Raises a question. Well, is it appropriate, and would it be applied in those situations? And that again gets back to a question from Commissioner Pomari about SNAs and things. So that will be wrapped up in that reply. Okay, thank you. Any further questions from the panel on light? No. Yeah, thank you very much. That was good. And thank you, Mr. Wright, for that. That was very elucidating too. Thank you. Appreciate it. So a moment to change hats, Mr. Beavis.
Yeah.
Go temporary.
Yes.
No.
There's
Yeah, look, hold on a corner. Oh, no, it might just be a numbering issue, but yeah. But yeah, is the online one? Just pause a moment for Mr. Beavis to organise himself. Where's the reference to S2? Do you know? The reference to S2. Not online.
Oh, it's referred to mine. To account for make is to.
No, no. Okay. That picks that up.
Just a recent one.
Mm. All right. Same Same routine, Mr. Beavis, if you'd like to just talk to your report and highlight any changes.
Absolutely, that
Recommendations.
sounds good.
Thank you.
So there's probably a little bit of useful context before on the chapter as well that I'll address in the introduction as well.
Mhm.
So the 42A report addresses submissions on the temporary activities chapter, as well as the Appendix 6, which is the permitted noise standards for temporary activities, which is referenced within the chapter, and then Appendix 7, which is the temporary activities events management plan, which is also referenced within the chapter.
Mm.
The events management plan did not have any substantive submission points, so it's recommended to be fully notified. The submission points on that one were primarily carried over from generalized points in stream 1, I believe. And then, so interesting points with Appendix 6 was, I believe it was the same panel with the exception of Commissioner Pomade, which was Commissioner Faulkner at the time. In the hearing stream 5, the noise reporting officer and acoustic experts addressed the substantive submission points on this regarding military training activities noise. But because they sort of necessarily tie into the chapter, it sort of deferred it to hearing stream 7 as a matter of sort of implementation. So as you may have gathered from my report, I didn't really seek to amend these at all because I consider it a finalised matter in that hearing stream, and then I've just sort of done an implementation exercise. Beyond this, I'm pretty happy to take my section 42A as read. Like the light chapter, no submitters provided any evidence in response to the 42A report, so I haven't provided any supplementary evidence. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, as you say, I was on the hearing stream panel 5, so we traversed the military noise standards quite well. Are there any questions from the panel, Mr. Beavis?
Yeah, well, we did have, just going back to hearing stream 5, we did have quite a discussion, and I've been in other forums when there's been temporary military training activities and associated issues with that, which have been raised. Same question I asked about light could also apply to the whole chapter of temporary activities. It's not a new thing for Wellington City, it's not a new thing nationally. How much consistency is there with other plans in the Wellington region in terms of dealing firstly with temporary military training activities and secondly on other temporary activities which would apply?
So I guess I'll address other non-military training activities first. So a lot of the chapter you would have seen sort of addresses bespoke temporary activities. So a lot of those are specific to Wellington City. Well, similar events could occur elsewhere, but I think it's just because of the importance of those events, such as the basin and stadium and also fireworks events. Those have specific provisions. So those are unlikely to be replicated in other plans just because they are quite specific to Wellington. But in terms of the temporary military training activities, so the submission from NZDF is quite similar across a lot of sort of recent plan changes. And other territorial authorities made amendments based on the suitability within their areas. So Porirua, for example, I believe they addressed the system of having the setback and the noise limits, and they sort of figured that based on the setback, there was no real area within Porirua where it would apply. So they have sort of amended it to not include any weapons firing explosives just because the standard that was provided wasn't really feasible, which is a sort of similar line of thinking that I had in my 42 report, except there is a little area within Wellington which it would be feasible, which is why I made that decision. So there is a lot of alignment on sort of minor matters, and a lot of people do take a similar approach of having that sort of two-step process, which does make it easier to meet those noise standards. But there are amendments based on whether it's, I guess, feasibility and other matters within the area.
Okay, that's helpful. So your two-stage process is managing, we were talking about TMTA, is a bunch of soldiers running around a particular place doing something for a week or two as one stage. And the second one is when they're using explosives. Is that the two-stage approach you're referring to?
When I say two-stage approach, I mean referring to their noise standards with their weapons and explosives. So their idea is having, I think there's a noise limit which they can meet, which is a sort of wherever that noise limit is met comparative to a noise sensitive activity, but there's also setbacks based on those noise limits. So the idea is that I think they've got two setbacks. So the one that they've submitted is 500 metres during the day and 1250 metres during the night. So the idea is that at 500 metres during the day, those noise limits are met, but they don't need to measure that noise because the assumption is that that setback distance would meet that noise limit anyway, and the evidence they provided suggested in their modelling that that was fairly accurate, because they used quite, I guess, I can't remember the term they used, but it was quite favourable to sort of noise limits, I mean, conditioned parameters that propagated noise more. So it's kind of like worst case scenario, if that makes sense. So
Okay.
that's sort of the two-stage approach that I'm talking about.
Oh, fair enough. Yeah, it's interesting. We don't have any evidence from New Zealand Defence Force and so forth, but you have taken into account some of their issues in terms of your report.
Yeah, just insofar as it links to the rules. So again, I didn't really seek to amend the technical standards because I sort of considered that those were addressed in hearing stream 5. So sort of a fairness, like a lot of issues pop up for the address in 2 hearing streams, but there are some elements of it. Like, for example, I think they tried to include a notice period within their noise standards, which wasn't really appropriate to sit within those noise standards, which was acknowledged by the experts in the hearing stream. So that has been implemented into the standard in the chapter itself rather than the noise standards. And there is also the applicability of those noise standards across zones, which is addressed by the rule as well. So there is some elements of it that was subject to change based on the chapter, but other, like the technical noise standards themselves, I think, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Nothing further.
Thank you. Mr. Murray?
Good, Arnold. Just a couple of questions for you. Firstly, in relation to paragraph 72 of your report, and here you're responding to a submission from Spader, yes, regarding engagement with mana whenua. And you make the point there that simply being on a site of significance to Māori does not trigger a separate resource consent under this chapter. So I take it that it would be a permitted activity, would it, to conduct a temporary activity within the extent of a site of or area of significance to Māori?
Yeah, so insofar as the temporary activities chapter is concerned, that would be correct, as long as they're abiding by the other standards, of course, but they would also need to comply with the sites and areas of significance to Māori chapter as well. So there's those regulations as well. Okay, so that would kick in, because I was just looking at the rules, R1 temporary activities, and the permitted activity status there, which requires compliance with S1, 3 and 4. And S1 just deals with the duration of the temporary activity. S3 deals with hours of operation, and 4 deals with noise levels. So there's nothing there to trigger, the fact that the temporary activity might be occurring on a sensitive cultural site. Yeah, so you're correct. As notified through the requirements of the permitted activity status, there's no protection for sites and areas of significance to Māori. It's only engaged in the restricted discretionary status as a policy consideration, a P4, and then also the events management plan has consideration as well, I think, for engagement with mana whenua. Yeah. Yes, I can see that, and so I'm just wondering how we get to that. But you're saying that it doesn't, in essence, it wouldn't really matter, because the
the SASM's chapter would apply, those provisions would apply anyway.
Yeah, they would apply. I believe the intent behind having it in the restricted discretionary status was because I think it was primarily because of the temporary buildings as well, like the impact that they could have on the site as well. But
Absolutely. Yeah, that was one of my concerns around the ancillary buildings and structures associated with temporary activities. But also the nature of the activity may not be compatible, quite apart from whether it, has a physical, whether it causes disturbance to the site or any kind of physical damage to it, is one thing. But there may also be, certain temporary uses that wouldn't be considered to be compatible with a site of cultural significance, depending on what kind of site it was. So I would have thought that I'd be interested in your view actually on, whether, given that context, there might actually be a case for mana whenua engagement in relation to any temporary activity that's intended to occur within a SASM. What would your response be to that?
Yeah, I could see merit in that approach because, as you said, like there's no in the standards that are required for the permitted activity status. There's nothing specific that sort of accounts for sites and areas of significance to Māori. So I could see, benefits in that approach as well. Definitely, yeah, I agree.
Do you see any difficulty in including provision to enable that to happen?
I mean, in terms of process, yeah, I think we're aware there probably wouldn't be scope, but in terms of so the only submitter that really addressed this was the film, and I don't know if they specifically addressed why it would be an issue. They sort of just said they disagreed with requiring engagement to do short-term filming on sites and areas of significance to Māori. So they didn't really provide any content, but so there's no evidence specifically addressing the fact that it might be difficult, but also that wasn't really something that people needed to address for the permitted activity status. So it probably need to talk to concerned parties and as well to see whether that, well, the difficulty of implementation, also the suitability as well.
Thank you. That would be helpful. I think that I'm just checking to see if there was anything else in relation to that particular one. Oh, just looking at the policies and the headings. That middle one, temp P2, minimise and mitigate adverse effects. It doesn't really. That doesn't really address the policy intent. I don't think. Actually, that's a question for you. Is that heading consistent with the intention of that policy, which seems to me to be more about compatible activities, I guess, or preserving amenity or something, but minimise and mitigate adverse effects. Is that an appropriate fit for the policy?
I take your point. It's not something I'd considered. I imagine the intention behind the draft, because this is also a chapter that didn't initially draft, but the intention was probably that those statements there about the scale, frequency, nature, and duration is sort of the adverse effects that they're trying to minimise and mitigate. But I do take your point that it's sort of framed more as like, we want to provide for these activities where they're compatible. So perhaps the language of the title of the policy isn't consistent with.
Yes, I mean, it may be that the minimise and mitigate, or maybe avoid, remedy, and mitigate, or whatever it is, the adverse effects needs to be incorporated into the actual policy itself and a separate heading.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Applied, but I'd be interested in your guidance on that. And then just one last question. Yes, done that one. In relation to Other relevant district plan provisions, so just above the objectives, there's an explanation there of district-wide chapters that are relevant. And the tangata whenua one, it refers to the final part of the last part of that sentence says matters significant to tangata whenua and protects and mitigates. So protects and mitigates activities that may impact on tangata whenua land, etc. I just wanted to double check that that is the correct reference. So the intention here is to both protect and mitigate activities. So in other words, to I guess protect activities that may impact positively and mitigate those that may impact negatively on tangata whenua land, etc. Is that the intent there?
This isn't something that I'd considered, so I might have to talk to the reporting officer for stream 1 that addresses the tangata whenua chapter to make sure that the intent there is correct.
Yeah, I think because I mean they seem to be at odds, but it may well be that the intention is to do both. It's just not clear.
Yeah, I agree. I can see that from the wording. So yeah, I'd probably write a reply matter just to confirm that with the reporting officer for the
Thank
chapter.
you. And I'll let you finish that first, sorry.
Good to go.
And just one final small correction. Above the tangata whenua, you've got sites of significance to Māori. And of course, it should be sites and areas.
Yeah.
I do see that inconsistency all the way through.
Yeah, that's good.
Just a small
I'll
point
make sure to
there
amend that.
Quite important. Thank you. That's very helpful. Kia ora.
Mr. Black?
Wait till he's finished writing.
Sure.
Rest. Fire and emergency services. I'm surprised they didn't take up your suggestion of providing some evidence, because they've suggested a whole framework for a policy rule framework. And you've gone through. Are you, in the absence of them giving you evidence to it, are you satisfied that actually the S4 actually provides sufficient scope for them? You've said this means temporary emergency services training noise standard is already very enabling under Temp S4. So are you satisfied that their activities are covered? Which is, but you expected a bit more feedback from them, but
Yeah, I
assume you haven't heard anything. From
No,
them.
I haven't heard anything from them because I was quite open to their suggestion. It was just there was a few weird things about it that I just wasn't super clear on, so I wasn't super confident in developing a new framework for them specifically in the absence of that. There are a few, the standards are sort of more aimed at quite high noise level thing, and you might have noticed, I think I noted in the section 42 report, but in their submission as well, their noise levels that they require aren't super different from what's required in the noise chapter anyway. So there was one in particular I thought that sounds more than reasonable, really. But the other conditions, like their duration and I think their indicated pack down and setup times, were pretty similar to what was provided in the chapter anyway. So I think based on what they provided, which is you'd hope is what they think is important for their activities, I think they still will be able to operate under the chapter as notified. Fine. So yeah, that's why I was semi-comfortable with retaining it as notified, but also as I noted in the 42A report, I was quite sympathetic to their submission because I don't think there was anything super unreasonable about what they provided. It was just a few things that were unclear.
Assume they're reasonably satisfied that what you've said is that the activities are covered.
Yeah, potentially.
You were satisfied.
Yeah, because I think I noted in the 42A report that they also submitted on the noise chapter because they submitted their noise limits for these temporary activities to the noise chapter as a standard, which was a little bit odd. But so that also can talk to they also submitted on the noise chapter, but that was rejected as well, and I don't think they responded to that either. So, and I think it was a similar approach where I think the reporting officer was open to the idea and suggested that it should come forward for evidence, but didn't provide anything. So,
thank you. I think there's a typo on the page. I just want to correct because it was paragraph 156. just want to make sure I've read this correctly.
Yep.
So in the last sentence of paragraph 156, just picking up, it says, it's presumed this was a mistake, which Mr. Simon has corrected, the higher noise limits and the lower duration and the lower limits.
Yeah, I think that'd be correct. Yeah, because if I recall the submitted table, yeah, they'd switched them around. And then I think it was a recommendation from the panel that they accept Mr. Simon's recommendation to switch those over.
So I've got that right. It's lower,
Yeah.
should read lower. That's how it kind of reads in the table.
Oh, yeah. Was there any, sorry.
What do you, it is a mistake, is it?
Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah, it was a
okay,
typo,
I just wanna
yeah.
Make sure that, I
Yeah.
thought you were reading it again just to make sure.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay,
cool.
that's
Yeah.
it.
Okay, thank you. No, I have no further questions. So thank you very much, Mr. Beavis, for your help and assistance in that. That was good. So with that, that's the report back from council officers for hearing stream 7 concluded. Tomorrow, we will commence at 9 o'clock, and basically on Thursday and Friday, we have a full schedule for most of the day. So we will take advantage of today's early closing to do a site visit. And apart from that, we'll see everybody tomorrow morning. So thank you very much. The hearing is adjourned until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.